Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. This year's World Space Week theme is Satellites Improve Life. Joining me to discuss all things space is Andrew Chanin, CEO ProcureAM. Andrew, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Trade Talks.
Thanks for having me, Jill.
And before we get into satellites, what is the legal definition of space? It's a very broad concept, especially as newer technologies get introduced.
Well, we're still trying to figure out something that everyone can agree on. And the most agreed upon definition of space is essentially where the Earth's atmosphere ends and space begins, which would be roughly 100 kilometers, 62 miles above sea level. And that's the area that's believed to be where a winged craft cannot get enough air to achieve lift.
What's interesting with satellites, we're reliant on satellite infrastructure for a variety of things that many people probably aren't even aware of. What are some of the use cases?
Well, the easiest one to think about right now is this interview wouldn't likely be possible without satellites helping. So communications, I think, is what most people typically think about when they think about satellites. And what does that include? That's internet, satellite radio, satellite television. Our broadband internet is very reliant upon satellites. But some of the other use cases that people might not be as familiar with is weather and tracking things like climate change. And then from a government and military perspective, surveillance and secure communications is extremely essential. And as we essentially develop satellite technology to become stronger and more robust, it's able to accomplish so much more. And just one very easy thing that we might take for granted and not realize is the way Uber works, or Seamless and delivery apps are all reliant upon GPS technology, which is a satellite-based technology. And just some of the few examples that we can easily grab to, which people don't necessarily realize how it's affecting their everyday lives. But without satellites, so much of what we do on a daily basis would be impossible.
Tell us about Nasdaq listed UFO and how investors can get exposure to space related industries. What sectors and examples of stocks are in there? And is this actively managed, or is there an underlying index associated with it?
So UFO is an ETF listed on Nasdaq with over 30 publicly traded space companies from around the world, all specializing in various areas of the space economy. And it is a passive fund. It tracks a passive index, which is the S Network Space Index, which is co-designed by a former director of the Space Foundation. And it's a way for investors to get exposure to these many different companies. Some fall in communications, some fall in aerospace and defense, and even some consumer exposure as well. And really, it's a way to get exposure to just so many different companies with a pure play kick to it. So it's looking for companies that are deriving ideally over 50% of their revenues from space related businesses and services, but also realizing that there are some major players in the space industry that aren't necessarily pure play companies. The index leaves up to 20% available for companies that are these more aerospace and defense, more diversified companies that aren't necessarily deriving a majority of their revenues from space.
What's the benefit of getting exposure to space through an ETF wrapper versus stock picking on your own?
Well, first and foremost, stock picking is always very difficult. And unless you're sitting over it and watching every move, it can be very difficult to build and manage those portfolios for the long term. But some of the other great things in my mind about using an ETF wrapper is the ability to get instant diversification. So in this instance, we have over 30 companies, not just from the US, but from around the world. And it can be very difficult for individuals to actually build a truly diversified global portfolio of stocks. And ETFs have embedded in them some interesting tax potential benefits that might make it more efficient for an individual to actually use the ETF wrapper versus trying to pick individual stocks. And lastly, because it follows an index, which is a living, breathing index, it rebalances quarterly, it reconstitutes semi-annually. It's constantly looking for new companies that are entering the space industry, either becoming more pure play, they're IPOing, or in some cases actually removing companies that are no longer meeting the qualifications of the index methodology for inclusion. So it is a way for investors to follow the emerging space industry as it evolves over time.
All right, Andrew, great to see you. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.